She sold herself to save her mother, but the millionaire made a shocking offer. Before we dive into this gripping story, we invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel to support our work. We hope you enjoy it. From the 45th floor of one of Chicago's most towering skyscrapers, Logan Whitmore gazed out at a city that never seemed to sleep. Behind the glass walls framing his spacious office, the view stretched across the maze of bustling avenues, the historic rooftops downtown, and the shimmering blue of Lake Michigan in the distance. Impeccable in his dark suit, Logan had just signed a billion-dollar contract to expand his textile empire to the West Coast, solidifying his dominance even further. His workspace, dominated by dark wood and minimalist decor, reflected not just success, but a profound sense of isolation. Every new victory seemed to build another wall around him, as if power itself were pulling him further and further away from the ordinary world. While Logan signed yet another triumph, a few miles away, Grace Sullivan was finishing another exhausting shift at the small cafe where she worked, not far from the bustling Magnificent Mile. Her feet throbbed with pain, and her rumpled uniform spoke volumes about the long hours and accumulated fatigue. But Grace refused to give in. In her eyes burned the determination she had inherited from her mother, Helen Sullivan, who had always taught her to fight for her dreams. And it was for Helen that her heart now ached. The news from the hospital earlier that day had left no room for false hope. Helen urgently needed a surgery that was both critical and prohibitively expensive to survive. The Northwestern Hospital, where Helen was admitted, felt even colder under the gray evening sky. In room 312, surrounded by the rhythmic beeping of monitors, Grace held her mother's hand as she slept, searching for strength where there was hardly any left. The doctor had been blunt. Without surgery, Helen only had a few weeks to live. The cost of the procedure, however, was far beyond anything Grace could possibly afford. Her meager paycheck as a server barely covered the essentials. No insurance plan would cover the specialized treatment Helen needed. Every possible solution seemed more unreachable than the last, pulling her deeper into a despair that threatened to consume her entirely. Walking back to the small apartment she shared with Lily Adams, Grace barely noticed the flashing neon lights or the sluggish early evening traffic around her. The pain in her chest was almost physical, crushing. How could she stand by and watch her mother fade away without fighting until the very end? The rain-slicked streets mirrored her inner turmoil, each step echoing the weight of impossible decisions she would soon have to make. When she finally reached the door of their tiny studio, she was greeted by Lily's tight embrace. Her friend already knew, just by looking at her, that the news wasn't good. Seated at the cramped kitchen table, with the smell of fresh coffee trying to cut through the heavy tension, Lily brought up something Grace hadn't dared consider. She spoke of Logan Whitmore, the textile tycoon who, according to whispers, helped people in desperate situations. Not through open charity or public donations, but through private agreements whose terms few knew. Grace frowned, skeptical and hesitant. Yet even that uncertainty seemed preferable to the crushing certainty of losing her mother without trying everything. Lily explained that someone she knew had once been helped by Logan during a critical moment. However, the details were murky, and the full consequences never entirely revealed. Help came, yes, but always with unusual conditions, so they said. Grace listened carefully, a fierce battle raging inside her between fear of the unknown and the desperate need to save her mother. The idea of approaching someone like Logan Whitmore, of exposing her vulnerability to him, terrified her. But it would be even more terrifying to let her mother slip away without doing everything in her power to stop it. In the dead of night, sitting on the edge of her bed, the card with Logan's address trembling in her hands, Grace made her decision. She would face her fears, cross that threshold, even if she had no idea what awaited her on the other side. For Helen, she would do anything, even if it meant stepping into a world where agreements weren't based solely on money, but also on sacrifices that could change her life forever. The dawn broke through a light mist that made Chicago seem even more somber. Grace put on her best outfit, a simple pair of black pants and a navy blue blouse, and pinned her hair back with a makeshift clip. The city outside seemed indifferent to the silent battles fought along its avenues. When Lily handed her a small lunch wrapped in paper, Grace smiled in gratitude. It was a simple gesture, but filled with care and hope. Two things she knew she couldn't afford to waste that day. Before leaving, she paused for a moment in front of the living room mirror. Her green eyes, a gift from Helen, looked more determined than ever. "For you, Mom," she whispered before stepping through the door toward an uncertain future. The card with Logan Whitmore's address was tucked safely in the pocket of her jacket. Her heart, however, was pounding wildly, anticipating what could very well be the most decisive moment of her life. The headquarters of Whitmore Industries was a giant of steel and glass towering over the city center, reflecting the heavy grayness of the sky. As she passed through the automatic doors, Grace was immediately enveloped by the scent of leather, polished wood, and coffee, the very essence of a world she had never belonged to. In a lobby, hurried executives crossed paths with impassive expressions, paying no attention to the young woman clutching her bag tightly against her chest like a last shield. The receptionist, a platinum-haired woman in a flawless suit, gave Grace a quick once-over before asking the purpose of her visit. With a steady voice, though her palms were sweating, Grace replied that she wished to speak with Mr. Whitmore. The assistant tapped a few keys on the computer and, without changing her neutral expression, told her to wait. Grace sat down on a nearby armchair and tried to ignore the cold creeping up her spine. While she waited, time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second hammering at her insecurities. She thought of Helen, lying in that hospital bed, her weary eyes still searching for a sliver of hope. That memory gave her the strength to stay put, resisting the urge to turn around and run. Eventually, a woman in a black suit approached her and introduced herself as Sophie Lambert. Calling her by name, Sophie said, "Right this way, please." Her politeness felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. She made a brief comment. "You're lucky. Mississippi Mr. Whitmore doesn't usually see anyone without an appointment." Grace stood up and followed Sophie down a wide hallway, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The private elevator took them to a higher floor, where the atmosphere shifted. Up here, the air felt thinner, as if it belonged to another universe, a place reserved for those who shaped the destiny of thousands without ever mingling with them. When they exited the elevator, Sophie led her to a set of large, solid wooden doors. She knocked softly before opening them, motioning for Grace to step inside. The moment had come. At the far end of the spacious office, with windows framing Chicago like a living work of art, stood Logan Whitmore. His back was to her, surveying the city like a king overlooking his kingdom. And it was to him that Grace would now have to lay bare her vulnerability, betting everything she had on one final, desperate chance to save the person she loved most in the world. Logan Whitmore turned as he heard the door close behind Grace. His piercing gaze locked onto hers, making her stomach twist with nerves. In person, he was even more imposing, the kind of man who commanded respect without ever needing to raise his voice. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Logan simply observed her. There was a cool, assessing look in his eyes, as if he were measuring not just her simple clothes, but the quiet strength in her posture. With a small nod, he gestured for her to sit in the chair, facing his large glass desk. Grace walked over, keeping her shoulders straight despite the tension threatening to overwhelm her. Logan placed his hands on the desk, fingers interlaced, and spoke with the calm control that seemed to be his trademark. "Tell me, Miss Sullivan, what brings you here?" His deep voice filled the room. No need to raise it to command attention. Grace took a deep breath before she began explaining. She spoke of her mother's illness, the urgency of the surgery, and the crushing cost of the procedure. Her words were clear and steady, without melodrama, but without hiding the gravity of the situation either. Logan listened in silence, not interrupting once, his face as unreadable as marble. When she finished, a heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. Logan leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully as he studied the young woman in front of him. Finally, he spoke. "The money for your mother's surgery can be arranged today." Grace felt her heart jolt, a spark of hope breaking through her anguish. But Logan continued, his voice sharp and precise, like a finely honed blade. "However, as with any agreement, there will be a condition." He didn't rush to explain further, letting the weight of uncertainty settle heavily between them. Grace held his gaze, even as a cold sweat prickled at the back of her neck. She hadn't come here expecting charity. She knew every favor came with a price. "What's the condition?" she asked, her voice sounding stronger than she felt. Logan rested his elbows on the desk, leaning slightly toward her. "Tonight, at 9 o'clock, I expect you at my home. No questions, no guarantees." His tone was calm, yet left no room for negotiation. It was clear, if she wanted the help, she would have to agree to the invitation. The words hit Grace like a sentence. There were no details, no explanations, just the demand and the promise that her mother would get a chance to live. For a brief moment, she considered backing out. But the image of Helen, struggling to breathe in that hospital bed, filled her mind, giving her the strength to stand her ground. With a slight nod, she accepted the proposition, even though she had no real idea of what would be expected of her. Logan didn't smile, nor did he show any sign of relief. He simply picked up a small business card from the desk and slid it toward her. "The driver will be waiting at the main entrance at 8:30, he said, his voice calm and deliberate. Without warm goodbyes or unnecessary gestures, he signaled that their meeting was over. Grace rose slowly, tucked the card into her bag, and without looking back, walked out of the office. The elevator ride down felt like an eternity. When she finally reached the ground floor, Grace headed for the exit, feeling as if she had crossed an invisible line, one from which there was no return. She knew that by accepting that invitation, she was stepping into an uncertain future. But she also knew there was no other choice. For her mother's life, she would face whatever awaited her. Grace crossed the streets of Chicago without really noticing the path she took. Her feet moved automatically, carrying her back to the small studio apartment she shared with Lily Adams. As soon as she stepped inside, she was met by Lily's anxious eyes. Lily rushed toward her, abandoning a still steaming cup of tea on the counter. "And what happened?" Lily asked, her voice tight with fear. Grace let her bag fall onto the worn sofa and exhaled deeply before answering. "I did it, but there's a condition." They sat side by side on the small, battered couch as Grace, in a low voice, explained the agreement Logan had proposed. Lily listened, her expression a mix of shock and worry. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" she asked, almost in a whisper. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion and anguish settle in her chest. "I don't have a choice, Lily. It's my mother's life. I would do anything for her." They stayed embraced for a few moments, drawing strength from each other, until the clock on the wall reminded them that time was running out. Grace took a long shower, trying to wash the anxiety away along with the warm water. She chose her plainest black dress, the same one she wore to job interviews, and pinned her hair up in a simple bun. She avoided wearing much makeup. She wanted to look dignified, not seductive. As she glanced at herself in the mirror one last time, she saw a determination in her eyes she hadn't known was there. She grabbed her small purse and Logan's card, then headed down the building's stairwell, her heart pounding wildly. A black car was already waiting at the curb. A man in a dark suit, his expression stern, opened the back door for her without a word. Grace climbed in, feeling the cold leather against her exposed legs. During the ride, she kept her gaze fixed on the city lights, which now seemed distant and unreal. Her thoughts were consumed by Helen, her mother's tired smile, the hope that still shimmered in her eyes. It was that hope Grace clung to now, pushing aside the fear that tried to whisper doubts in her ear. After about 20 minutes, the car passed through tall wrought iron gates, revealing a property surrounded by immaculate gardens. Logan Whitmore's mansion rose before her like a fortress, its illuminated windows casting shadows across the light stone facade. The driver parked near the main entrance and quickly got out to open the door for her. Grace stepped onto the driveway hesitantly, the cold night air whipping against her legs and arms. An elegant woman, dressed entirely in black, was waiting at the entrance. Without speaking, she motioned for Grace to follow her. They crossed a wide foyer decorated with understated works of art and ascended a marble staircase to the second floor. Each step Grace took echoed in her mind like a countdown to something inevitable. At the end of the hallway, the woman opened a door and gestured for Grace to step inside. It was a spacious room, decorated in a sober, luxurious style. The bed was neatly made, the lighting soft. Everything seemed carefully prepared to receive someone. The door closed behind Grace, leaving her alone. She crossed the room and pulled the curtain aside to look out at the night. Chicago stretched before her eyes, indifferent to what she was about to face. Clutching the fabric of her dress in her trembling hands, Grace took a deep breath and braced herself for whatever was to come. She knew that, whatever happened tonight, she had already crossed a line she could never return from. Grace stood by the window for long minutes, searching within herself for the strength needed to face the unknown. The cold glass beneath her fingers reflected the sleeping city, the lights of Chicago flickering like distant stars. Her mind wandered, creating scenarios and imagining what might happen next. Every breath she drew felt like preparation for the inevitable. Her heart pounded heavily in her chest, a constant reminder of the gravity of what she was about to do. She was there for Helen's life, and she wouldn't allow fear to paralyze her. The sound of the doorknob turning pulled her out of her thoughts. Grace slowly turned and saw Logan entering the room. He wore a dark suit without a tie, his shirt partially unbuttoned at the collar. In his hands, he carried 2 glasses of red wine. He approached her with calm, unhurried steps and offered her one of the glasses, his gaze steady but without pressure or demand. Grace hesitated for a moment before accepting. Her fingers brushed lightly against his, and the contact sent a shiver of tension through her. Logan watched her closely, as if trying to see beyond the surface, beyond the fear she struggled so hard to conceal. He took a few steps back and leaned casually against the edge of a dresser, raising his own glass to his lips. "Your mother is already in surgery," he said casually, as if mentioning something ordinary. Grace felt her throat tighten and fought the urge to ask 1,000 questions. She needed to trust, needed to believe that everything was truly being taken care of, just as he had promised. She murmured a barely audible "thank you," keeping her eyes fixed on the wine swirling in her glass. Logan set his glass down on the dresser and crossed his arms, observing her without rush. "Do you know why you're here, Grace?" His voice, although calm, carried a weight that went beyond simple curiosity. Grace lifted her gaze to meet his, feeling vulnerable but also determined. "I know I'm here to honor the commitment I made," she replied firmly. Logan gave a slight nod, as if acknowledging the courage standing before him. He approached slowly but didn't invade her space, respecting the invisible line that still separated them. With an unexpected gesture, he took the glass from Grace's hand and placed it beside his own. Then, he pulled a soft wool blanket from the back of a chair and spread it out over the bed. "I want you to rest tonight. Nothing more will be asked of you." His words, spoken with a serene and final tone, left Grace stunned. She blinked a few times, not sure she had heard him correctly. Seeing the confusion on her face, Logan added, "It was never my intention to hurt you." Grace sat on the edge of the bed, her heart still racing. She felt lost somewhere between relief and disbelief. Everything she had feared, all the terror she had carried with her up to that moment, seemed to dissolve with those few simple words. Logan settled into a nearby armchair, maintaining a relaxed posture, as if wanting to reassure her that she was safe. For a long time, they remained there, exchanging brief glances, building a silent truce based on something that went beyond the initial agreement, something neither of them could yet name, but that had already begun to form between them. Emotionally drained, Grace eventually lay down, pulling the blanket over her body. She glanced at Logan out of the corner of her eye, and for the first time, she noticed something different in his expression, a kind of weariness that didn't come from work, but from life itself. There was a restrained melancholy in his features, as if he too carried hidden battles of his own. Maybe, she thought before closing her eyes, they had more in common than she could have ever imagined. The night passed slowly, the darkness wrapping the room in a protective cocoon. For the first time in days, Grace fell asleep without nightmares, comforted by the strange and unexpected feeling that, against all odds, she was safe. The first light of morning slipped through the gaps in the heavy curtains, drawing faint lines of brightness across the silent room. Grace opened her eyes slowly, as if emerging from a deep, heavy dream, not immediately recognizing where she was. The mattress beneath her felt too soft. The air carried a scent she wasn't used to, a blend of leather, polished wood, and something subtly masculine. As the memories of the previous night settled in, she slowly lifted her head and spotted Logan Whitmore seated in an armchair near the window. He remained there, still and attentive, like a sentry standing guard. The city unfolded behind him, its lights still flickering in the timid awakening of dawn. Logan said nothing. He simply tilted his head slightly in acknowledgement, as if letting her wake up at her own pace, without pressure, without expectation. It was a kind of consideration Grace hadn't anticipated, and in a way, it disarmed her more than any words could have. She sat up slowly, keeping the blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a fragile shield against the unknown. Logan stood with the same composed calm that seemed to accompany his every movement. He walked over to a small side table where 2 half-empty wine glasses and an abandoned bottle rested. Without rushing, without intruding on the space she instinctively kept around herself, he said, his voice deep and steady, "Your mother's out of danger. The surgery was a success." For a moment, Grace thought she hadn't heard him right. The wave of relief that crashed through her was so overwhelming that she had to close her eyes and take a deep breath to keep from breaking down. She had promised herself she would stay strong, that she wouldn't fall apart in front of him. But hearing those words, knowing her mother had been given another chance, was more than her exhausted heart could bear. Even so, Grace simply nodded, unable to speak, while Logan discreetly stepped back to give her space. Time seemed to stop between them, suspended in a tension unlike the night before. Now there was no fear, no expectation, only a strange stillness, as if both of them understood that something had changed profoundly, even if neither dared to name it. When Grace finally rose from the bed, smoothing the wrinkles from her dress with nervous hands, Logan remained at a respectful distance. There were no touches, only a silence charged with something that, somehow, didn't feel empty. She made her way to the door, hesitating for a second, unsure if she should say something. It was Logan who broke the moment, calling her name in a voice that was firm but not harsh. "Grace!" She turned, meeting those gray eyes again, eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "You don't owe me anything," he said, his voice brutally simple, dismantling any resistance she might have had. It wasn't a favor he was holding over her. It was a gesture that came with no price. Grace blinked, trying to absorb what he had just said. Since the day before, she had lived under the shadow of fear, of an unpayable debt, of the feeling she had sold her soul to save someone she loved. And now, standing there, Logan had demolished all of that with a single sentence. No demands, no conditions. Only an unexpected freedom that left her more vulnerable than any obligation ever could. Her throat tightened, but she forced a small nod, unable to trust her own voice at that moment. Logan didn't insist. He simply watched her leave, his gaze carrying far more than he allowed to show. Grace moved quickly down the hallway, guided once again by the discreet woman who had led her the night before. The mansion's grand staircase felt endless under her trembling feet. With every step, the strange mixture of relief and uncertainty grew inside her. Like a tide, she wasn't sure whether to fear or embrace. The cold morning air enveloped her as she stepped through the front door. The same black car was waiting, the silent driver holding the door open for her. Grace got into the car, and this time, her stomach didn't churn with anxiety. Instead, she leaned her forehead against the cold window and let herself cry quietly. Tears of exhaustion, tears of relief. As the car glided through Chicago's still empty streets, Grace thought of her mother, Helen, strong, resilient, alive. She thought of Lily and their little home, which now seemed so far away. And she thought of Logan and the unexpected gesture he had made. When she opened her eyes again, she took a deep breath and adjusted her purse on her lap. The sun was beginning to rise in the cloudy sky, and she knew it was time to move forward. The morning chills still cut through the streets of Chicago when Grace reached the small apartment she shared with Lily. Exhaustion weighed on her body like an anchor, but relief kept her awake. She kicked off her shoes at the door, dropped her bag onto the couch, and allowed herself a few minutes just sitting there, letting the silence fill her from within. Lily, already awake and with dark circles under her eyes, appeared at the bedroom door and rushed toward her. Grace hugged her tightly, letting the weight of the previous night pour from her shoulders. Without needing many words, Lily understood that somehow things had worked out. After a quick shower and slipping into comfortable clothes, Grace made herself a strong cup of coffee and forced herself to eat something before heading back out. She knew Helen would need her at the hospital, and more than that, she needed to see with her own eyes that the surgery had really happened, that her mother was alive and moving forward, just as they had hoped. The hospital still smelled of disinfectant and carried the cold sterility of medical spaces when Grace passed through the revolving doors and made her way to the floor where Helen was recovering. She found Lily in the waiting room, dozing with her head resting on her hands. The clock showed just past 9 in the morning. Grace gently touched Lily's shoulder, waking her, and together they walked toward room 312. When Grace pushed the door open, she found her mother asleep, her vital signs steady on the monitors, her face still pale but peaceful. It was a silent confirmation that, against all odds, Helen had made it through the surgery. Grace sat down beside the bed and took her mother's hand, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath her fingers. In that small hospital room, the outside world ceased to exist. Debts, fears, and everything she had done to get to this point no longer mattered. All that mattered was that Helen was alive, breathing, and had a real chance to keep fighting. The hours dragged on inside the room, interrupted only by brief visits from nurses and the muted sounds of other patients in the hallways. Lily stayed for a short while, promising to return later with clean clothes and some food. Grace remained, patient and vigilant, guarding her mother's sleep like someone protecting a newly recovered treasure. It wasn't until early afternoon, when the gray winter light began creeping through the fogged windows, that Helen finally opened her eyes. The first look they shared was enough to flood the room with thick emotion, made up of everything they had endured together. Grace smiled, feeling tears stream down her face uncontrollably. Helen tried to lift her hand, and Grace gently helped her, leaning down to kiss her forehead. She whispered words of encouragement, of love, of gratitude. Helen didn't ask how everything had been resolved. She simply squeezed her daughter's fingers lightly and closed her eyes again, exhausted but alive. When Helen drifted back to sleep, Grace stepped out of the hospital to catch her breath. The sharp cold of the afternoon greeted her like a reminder that the world kept moving, indifferent to everything stirring inside her. She walked slowly through the nearby streets, thinking about all the challenges still ahead, the mounting medical bills, Helen's recovery, and the urgent need to find a better job. Going back to work at the cafe now seemed impossible, given everything she needed to manage. She was deep in thought when her phone rang inside her bag. With a tight chest, she answered and heard the calm, professional voice of Sophie Lambert, Logan Whitmore's senior administrative assistant. Sophie was inviting her to a meeting at Whitmore Industries later that afternoon. The message was clear. Logan wanted to see her personally. Grace didn't need further details. She already sensed that this summons carried more weight than mere formalities. Back at the apartment, Grace changed into a simple black skirt and a dark blue long-sleeve blouse. She pinned her hair into a discreet bun and applied just a touch of lipstick to avoid looking too worn out. Lily watched her every move with worried eyes, but said nothing. She knew that only Grace could decide what came next. Grace grabbed her bag and left, her stomach tightening with every step toward the bus stop. The ride to the city center felt longer than usual that late afternoon. When she finally reached the sleek glass and steel building of Whitmore Industries, the doorman recognized her immediately and waved her inside. At the front desk, the receptionist confirmed her name and directed her straight to the private elevator. The ascent was silent, marked only by the soft hum of the machinery and the quiet sound of Grace's own breathing. When the doors opened, Sophie was already waiting in the corridor, as serious and precise as ever. She led Grace to the large office where Logan awaited. He stood facing away from the door, looking out over the city sprawled beyond the windows. When he turned, his eyes found hers with the same unwavering intensity as before. Without any small talk, he motioned for her to sit and explained why he had called her. He needed someone to work directly with him on more discreet, private matters, tasks that demanded a level of trust and close coordination. Sophie would continue managing his general schedule and public commitments, but he needed someone for the confidential day-to-day decisions and sensitive documents. That was the role Logan wanted to offer her, and he saw Grace as the perfect person to fill it. The salary would be fair, and the hours flexible enough for her to continue supporting her mother's recovery without sacrificing her own stability. Grace listened in silence, absorbing every word. Working so closely with Logan would be an immense challenge, but it was also a real opportunity to build something beyond immediate survival. When Logan finished speaking, he waited patiently for her answer. Grace took a deep breath, met his gaze firmly, and accepted. Sophie handed her a preliminary contract and provided instructions for her first day. As Grace left the building, her heart was still racing, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was filled with conviction. She was taking a real step toward a different kind of life. Grace arrived at the Whitmore Industries building early in the morning, wrapped in the biting cold that still hung over Chicago. The lobby was bustling, filled with executives hurrying across the impeccably lit space as she clutched her bag tightly against her body, feeling the anxiety rising in her throat. She wore a simple suit she had bought months ago at a clearance sale, but it still carried the sense of seriousness necessary for the new challenge she was taking on. At the reception desk, she was directed to the private elevator that would take her to the top floor, where the company's most important offices were located. When the doors opened, Sophie Lambert was already waiting for her, punctual, with a polite smile that carried no trace of intimacy. Sophie led Grace to an adjoining room next to Logan's main office, an elegant, functional space strategically positioned so she could attend directly to his demands. As Sophie explained the basic duties Grace would assume, she clarified that she would remain responsible for general administration, corporate travel, and public events, but that Logan needed someone closer to handle confidential matters and tasks that couldn't be delegated across multiple departments. Grace would be organizing internal documents, filtering personal communications, attending restricted meetings, and supporting Logan in decisions that demanded discretion and agility. The volume of information was considerable, but Grace stayed attentive to every detail, calmly taking notes, fully aware of the responsibility she was about to shoulder. Sophie, though reserved, seemed to approve of Grace's serious demeanor. Every now and then, she shot her a quick, assessing glance, as if testing the strength of a rope before trusting it with weight. By the end of the morning, Grace already had her desk set up, her computer configured, and a stack of documents waiting to be reviewed. Around midday, Logan appeared for the first time since her arrival. He wore a dark gray suit without a tie, moving with the natural confidence of someone who is used to leading. He stopped at her new desk, observing Grace with that analytical gaze that seemed to see beyond the surface. He didn't smile, but there was a slight nod, a discreet acknowledgement. "Miss Sullivan," he said, his deep voice filling the space. "I need a simplified report from the last audit by the end of the day. Sophie will send you the data. I trust you'll know what's important." Grace nodded, managing to keep the anxiety threatening to shake her hands under control. Logan turned and walked away without waiting for further confirmation, as was his habit. It was a kind of confidence, sharp, almost ruthless, but in a way it motivated her to push herself even harder. She took a deep breath and dove into the work, determined to prove she belonged there. The next few hours moved at an intense pace. Between messages, calls, and reports, Grace found herself caught in a rhythm that demanded her full attention. There was no room for mistakes or hesitation. When Sophie delivered the necessary files, she offered only a brief comment. "Mr. Whitmore doesn't like repeating instructions." Grace understood the message clearly. She organized the data with precision, synthesizing technical information into clear, objective reports, trimming unnecessary details, and highlighting critical points. By the end of the day, She delivered the completed file directly to Logan. He reviewed the contents in silence, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken expectations. When he finished reading, he simply closed the folder, gave a brief nod, and said, "Keep it up. No unnecessary praise, no empty words." But for Grace, that dry acknowledgement was more than enough. It meant she had taken her first step in the right direction. In the days that followed, their working rhythm only intensified. Grace began accompanying Logan to internal meetings, preparing confidential documents, and managing parallel schedules that few inside the company even knew about. Working so closely with him was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Logan demanded excellence, but he also offered something rare: respect. He never treated her with condescension or impatience. He observed each of her initiatives carefully, and little by little, entrusted her with increasingly complex tasks. Their daily interaction, though strictly professional, started weaving a quiet bond between them. Small glances exchanged during long meetings, brief conversations at the end of busy days, gestures of acknowledgement that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Without either of them pushing for it, they began to occupy subtle spaces in each other's lives, building a silent companionship that grew amid the demands of work. Every night, Grace returned home exhausted, but strangely fulfilled. Lily could see the difference in her eyes, even if Grace spoke little about her new routine. There was a different energy in her now, a renewed drive to build something truly her own. She thought of Helen, how her mother's recovery was slowly but steadily progressing, and it made every sacrifice worthwhile. Deep down, Grace knew she was only just beginning a path that would demand even more from her than she had ever imagined. But she also knew that, for the first time in a long while, she had a real chance to change her story, and she was determined not to waste it. The following weeks passed by in such an intense rhythm that Grace barely noticed the days slipping away. At Whitmore Industries, each workday was a succession of challenges and demands that left no room for distractions. Her routine was shaped directly by Logan, who, though reserved in his gestures, made it clear he trusted her. The tasks he assigned her grew increasingly strategic, requiring discretion and sharp judgment. Grace managed parallel schedules, prepared summaries of confidential contracts, and reviewed proposals that had yet to be made public. Her direct access to Logan placed her in a unique position within the company. She wasn't an executive, nor a typical assistant. She was the person he entrusted with matters he wouldn't share with anyone else, and that transformed the dynamic between them into something that went far beyond a simple professional bond. At first, Grace worked hard to maintain a respectful distance, fully aware that her presence there was the result of extraordinary circumstances. But as they spent each day together, cracks began to form in the rigid formality she tried to uphold. There were inevitable moments when, during the preparation of a late-night report or while waiting silently for a delayed meeting, they would talk about things beyond work. They discussed books, travels, and little habits that surprised them both. Logan, always composed, allowed himself slight moments of relaxation and posture during those exchanges. And Grace, intuitive as she was, understood that these small concessions spoke louder than any declared words. Their growing closeness slipped into their lives without fanfare, built from details, from unexpected confidences, from the quiet laughter that escaped when they realized they thought the same way about a situation. As time went on, Logan began requesting Grace's presence, not only in internal meetings, but also in smaller gatherings with suppliers and strategic partners. He needed someone who could quickly grasp his instructions, who knew what should be said and what should be left unsaid. That practical trust elevated her position, giving her a subtle, but very real influence. Within the company, it became obvious that Grace had become close to Logan, even if no one dared to comment openly. Sophie, ever professional, respected the new division of roles, and although their relationship remained cordial, it maintained the appropriate distance their positions demanded. Grace focused on her work, knowing her growth couldn't rely solely on Logan's goodwill, but had to be earned through the competence she demonstrated with every task completed to perfection. Outside the corporate environment, Grace's life slowly adjusted as well. Helen's recovery was steady, though her treatment required patience and a level of care that consumed much of Grace's energy. Even so, she found time to support her mother, take care of their home, and keep alive the flame of hope that had been burning since the day everything changed. The nights were short, the exhaustion constant, but the joy of seeing her mother smile again made every sacrifice worthwhile. Lily, always attentive and caring, was her anchor during the moments when fatigue threatened to break her. Their friendship, already strong, deepened even further, offering stability amid the turbulence of Grace's new life. And in those moments when loneliness crept in, Grace found strength in the small gestures from Logan. The unspoken looks filled with tension and kept moving forward. In the middle of this new routine came an unexpected invitation. One afternoon, at the end of an exhausting day, Logan called Grace into his office. With the calm expression of someone carefully weighing his words, he explained that he would be attending an important corporate event the following week, a gala dinner gathering the top investors and partners of Whitmore Industries. He needed someone he could trust to assist him during the event, filtering conversations, organizing information, and providing support in situations that require discretion. Grace, surprised by the request, accepted immediately, aware that this mission would demand even more from her, not just professionally, but emotionally as well. Attending a social event alongside Logan would be very different from working within the safe structure of the office. It was a new territory, filled with expectations and possibilities she didn't yet know how to navigate. That night, lying in bed after a day that seemed never-ending, Grace stared at the dark ceiling, letting her thoughts wander. She recalled the invitation to the gala, the way Logan had looked directly into her eyes when making the request, as if he had full confidence in her ability to represent him in such an important setting. She also thought about their small day-to-day interactions, the discreet gestures of consideration that, although subtle, carried a silent weight in her routine. She didn't know exactly what it would be like standing beside him in a social setting, outside the protective walls of the office. But she sensed that night could mark a shift, even if she didn't yet know what kind. And despite trying to push away her fears, a part of her wanted to find out what might grow from the path that was slowly beginning to open before her eyes. The ballroom where the gala dinner was being held was a masterpiece of understated luxury. Grand chandeliers cast a golden glow over elegantly arranged tables, while the soft music of a string quartet filled the air. Grace adjusted the hem of her navy blue dress, the one Lily had helped her pick out the day before, feeling the light fabric glide over her skin. It was a simple design, free of excessive embellishments, but it flattered her silhouette with a quiet elegance. As she arrived, she spotted Logan across the room, speaking with a group of businessmen, commanding attention in his perfectly tailored black suit. Throughout the week, he had given her clear instructions on how she should act, screen approaches, discreetly accompany conversations, and make sure important information was noted and organized for later. But now, as their eyes met across the crowd, Grace realized that the night would demand something more from her than her usual competence. It would require balance, presence, and the ability to navigate spaces that extended far beyond professional boundaries. Logan crossed the ballroom with calm, assured steps, greeting a few people along the way until he reached her. His gray eyes swept over her from head to toe, not lingering, but leaving no doubt that he approved. "You're perfect for the occasion," he said in a low voice, formal yet carrying something more, a recognition that warmed the space between them. He offered his arm, and Grace, with a small smile of acceptance, rested her hand on it. They moved through the room together, introducing themselves to important guests, exchanging greetings with partners and investors. Grace kept her posture straight, her smile discreet, and her mind alert, absorbing the nuances of the conversations and supporting Logan with subtle notes and timely interventions whenever necessary. Their connection unfolded without fanfare, in coordinated gestures, quick glances, and measured words that filled in where the other left off. As the evening progressed, Grace began to notice something different in the way Logan spoke to her. Slight pauses in the middle of a sentence, longer glances, restrained smiles that seemed meant only for her. It wasn't overt, but it was impossible to ignore. There was a new softness in the way he included her in discussions, shielded her from intrusive questions, and guided her presence with a care that felt deeper than mere professionalism. Once most of the formal work obligations had been fulfilled, Logan invited her to join him on one of the hotel's side terraces, away from the main bustle. Grace accepted without hesitation, her heart racing beneath the dress, as if the night air itself carried a promise she couldn't yet name, but already felt with irresistible force. The terrace was wide, bordered by glass railings that revealed the illuminated city below. Chicago's lights spread out like a golden carpet under the night sky. Grace approached the edge, inhaling the cool air, trying to calm the growing tension inside her. Logan stood beside her, hands casually tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his body relaxed yet fully focused on her. For a few minutes, they stayed silent, simply sharing the view and each other's presence. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost intimate. "Thank you for tonight. You were impeccable." Grace turned to face him, and in the look they shared, there wasn't just professional gratitude. There was something else, something that until now had been carefully controlled, but now leaked through the cracks of his gaze, his stance, his quiet breath. The silence between them was thick with unspoken tension, a hesitation filled with meaning. Grace didn't look away. She felt it, that in this suspended space, in this small eternity that opened between them, there was a choice to be made. No promises, no certainties, just the raw truth of what they felt and had been pretending not to see. Logan took a step closer, his face leaning gently toward hers, as if still waiting for a signal of acceptance. Grace, without breaking eye contact, simply breathed deeply, letting everything she carried in her heart speak for her. Then Logan kissed her, a firm yet restrained gesture, as if honoring every second of that decision. The touch of his lips on hers was warm and steady, and Grace, without thinking, responded. There was no rush, no demand, only the silent acknowledgement of something that had been growing between them, inevitably. When they finally pulled apart, Logan's hands still rested lightly on her waist, and Grace's eyes reflected both the brilliance of the city and something more, something new, alive, and too real to be spoken aloud. Both of them knew that from that moment on, what they had built was no longer based solely on professional trust. Neither tried to shatter the moment with useless words. They remained there, under Chicago's night sky, sharing a silence filled with everything yet to come. The sunrise over Chicago painted the buildings in shades of gold and copper as Grace woke up, her heart still beating with a strange rhythm. It hadn't been an ordinary night. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. She could feel every detail of the previous evening still imprinted on her skin, and the memories that kept replaying with every tick of the clock. The touch of Logan's lips, the restrained warmth of his hands, the heavy silence that had fallen between them after the kiss. Nothing had been said when they left the terrace and returned to the main ballroom. They had parted ways, almost instinctively, as if both knew they needed to protect what had just happened, to shield it from prying eyes and premature judgments. Now, alone, far from the controlled elegance of the event, Grace allowed the emotions she had suppressed to surface. There was joy, fear, and a deep sense that something fundamental had shifted, something that could no longer be ignored. She tried, unsuccessfully, to distract herself with morning tasks. She made coffee, tidied up the apartment quickly, sent messages to Lily in the hospital, checking for updates on Helen. But the memory of Logan lingered, vivid and insistent in her mind. She wondered how he would react when they saw each other again in the corporate environment, where the rules hadn't changed, even though they had. Logan had always been a man of measured gestures and firm decisions. Grace knew he wouldn't allow emotions to interfere with work, and she didn't want to risk the opportunity she had fought so hard to earn, either. Yet doubt gnawed at her. Was that kiss just an isolated impulse, born of the moment, or was it the beginning of something they had both secretly wanted for much longer than they had dared to admit? When Grace arrived at Whitmore Industries, she felt the weight of her own expectations pressing down on her shoulders. The lobby was as busy as ever, and no one seemed to notice the turmoil she carried inside. Sophie greeted her with the same cordiality as always, handing her a report to review and instructions for an afternoon meeting. Everything went on as if the previous night had been just another social event. When Grace entered her small office, located just a few steps from Logan's, she found a note on her desk, written in his firm handwriting. "I need you in the 10 o'clock meeting. Logan." There was no emotion in the words, just a practical reminder that she remained an essential part of his routine. She placed the note in her drawer, took a deep breath, and prepared herself for the inevitable meeting. The meeting unfolded like so many others they had shared before. Logan was serious, direct, meticulous with details. Grace presented the requested documents, took notes during discussions, and interacted flawlessly with the other participants. No mention was made of what had happened the night before. No misplaced glances, no perceptible hesitation. To anyone watching, they were simply a boss and his assistant, executing their roles with admirable efficiency. But Grace knew and felt that beneath the surface, something vibrated between them with a silent force that could not be denied. It was as if every word spoken with professional precision was an effort to uphold the walls that had started to crack the night before. Later that afternoon, Logan asked for a private conversation. They were in his office, the door closed, the muffled sound of the city outside. He stood silently for a few moments, looking out the window before turning to her. "About last night," he began, his voice steady but without his usual coolness. "Nothing has to change, unless you want it to." Grace held his gaze, feeling the weight and tenderness contained in those few words. Logan was offering her the choice. They could continue as before, ignoring what they felt, or they could acknowledge the truth that now pulsed between them. "I trust you, Grace," he added, and in that simple sentence lay something that went beyond workplace hierarchy, something rooted in the trust they had built with every shared moment, every silent understanding over the past months. Grace moved closer to the desk slowly, never breaking eye contact. She didn't need many words to answer. She simply nodded, carrying all the certainty she felt in that quiet gesture. Logan allowed a slight smile to break across his face. A small smile, but one that lit up his expression in a way she had never seen before. The story they were about to write together would be built with the same strength they had already learned to trust in one another. The end. What did you think of this story? Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. See you next time.